empire in the Western world ruled from right here. All around me are remnants of the empire's greatest palaces, stadiums, and temples. But that's only just the beginning. The real story of this capital city isn't up here. It's down there. From the legendary excesses of its emperors to the neighborhoods of the common citizens living in their shadows. Rome's soil is filled with secrets. And we're going underground to find them. By the 1st century AD, Rome had grown into the largest city the world had ever known. Over 1 million people were packed within the city walls, an area of less than 10 square miles. Walking around today's Rome, you can see much of this ancient past, but you have no idea what you might be walking on top of. Anywhere you go, you could be stepping on a 2,000-year-old house, an emperor's ancient palace, or even the Circus Maximus, one of the largest sports arenas ever built. You can imagine the spectacle here 2,000 years ago, with 250,000 fans cheering and shouting as they watched the chariot scream around the deadly track. Up there on the Palatine Hill, the emperor would watch the race from his palace, and for a short time, the eyes of the Roman world were fixed on Circus Maximus. But in the shadow of Rome's largest stadium was a hidden temple to a secret society. Today, the area looks little more than a grassy field. But 1,700 years ago, it was the site of the world-famous Circus Maximus. But while the chariots raced around the track, a mysterious pagan cult practiced its secret rituals right next door. Today, this secret temple, like the Circus Maximus, is buried underground. But I was going to find it. Katie?
Yeah.
I met with Katie Parla, an expert on subterranean Rome, and Katie knew exactly where it was.
This is an area that lies between the Aventine Hill, which is on our right, and the Palatine Hill on our left. And this area was the site of public spectacle from the age of the Roman kings. So it's one of the earliest places in Rome to be developed, and it grew over time.
During his rule, Julius Caesar increased the capacity of the circus to 250,000, roughly 5 times the size of the Colosseum.
Circus Maximus was the largest hippodrome in Rome. It was a chariot racing stadium, and it also would have been used for other public spectacles like gladiator fights and wild beast hunts.
Right on this very spot, ordinary Romans and aristocrats alike came to the circus to watch thrilling and gory spectacles. Today, the grassy field sits more than 30 feet above where the original racetrack once sat, but there was no sign of the secret temple I was looking for. So where is this temple?
The temple is underneath this modern building.
The modern building was originally a pasta factory until the 1920s. Today, it's the storage facility for the Roman opera. And right beneath it is the 1,700-year-old temple called a Mithraeum.
So this is the entrance to the Mithraeum, a building that's closed to the public, but unarranged admittance.
We walked down 2 flights of stairs and over 1,500 years back in time. This forgotten temple of the mysterious religion covered a huge area, over 3,000 square feet. Holy God. I mean, this looks like I'm walking into the 2nd century here.
We've got a combination of 2nd century walls that formed part of a public structure, as well as huge 20th century pilasters that support the modern building above us.
This is like a secret world down here. While the fans at the Circus Maximus cheered for the races, they had no idea what was going on just behind the starting gates. The rituals of the followers of Mithras were top secret and practiced in this building. So what do we know about this secretive pagan society? During the 1st century BC, Rome hadn't accepted Christianity, so pagan cults were commonly followed. But unlike the Roman gods, who were publicly worshipped in massive ornate shrines across the empire, Mithraic rites were practiced in total secrecy. The followers of Mithraism had to be secretly initiated, and the religion didn't follow a written scripture, adding to the mystery. The members of this Eastern cult were known as the followers of Mithras. No one really knows where the religion came from, but it may have originally been linked to a Persian god the Romans called Mithras. Because Mithras was born in a cave, temples devoted to him were usually dark, windowless spaces with vaulted cave-like ceilings. This temple had 5 rooms, each approximately 33 feet long and 12 feet wide. You really get a feel for what would have been down here. There's so much detail work. You don't have to use your imagination, you can see it. And there was one relic here that survived the centuries untouched.
the most important work of art here, a votive offering. So this is an offering that was given to Mithras by a member of the Mithraic cult, and the inscription that runs across the top of this relief tells us that.
The marble statuary depicts the god Mithras stabbing a bull in the neck. This is 1,700 years old at least, and look at the condition of this thing. It's incredible. For the followers of Mithraism, the bull was a strong and noble creature and was the best sacrifice they could give.
This famous bull sacrifice is really the sort of fascinating aspect of the Mithraic religion, because it always is represented in Mithraic art, and in virtually all Mithraic sanctuaries you find a representation of it, but it's hard to imagine a bull ever being in a spot like this. This space could have held maybe 30 or 40 members of the Mithraic sanctuary, so that leads us to believe that the bull sacrifice is symbolic of something else.
But there's one major mystery. Why did they build their secret temple right by one of the busiest and most chaotic sites in ancient Rome?
Well, it's difficult to say why they chose this exact spot. Perhaps the charioteers that would have begun their races at the starting gates behind us followed Mithras. We know that there were perhaps hundreds of these Mithraic sanctuaries in Rome.
In fact, the remains of Mithraic sanctuaries have been discovered all over the former Roman Empire, suggesting it may have been spread by Roman soldiers who were drawn to the cult's emphasis on courage and honor.
We do know that the first followers of Mithras were predominantly from the military, and this makes sense because members of the military in the first centuries AD and BC were having a lot of contact with the kingdom of Parthia, modern-day Iraq and Iran.
Though there are a lot of unknowns surrounding the Mithraic religion, we can put some clues together about how they built this temple. Despite the elaborate detail on the statuary, much of the sanctuary was built haphazardly.
We've got a variety of different types of marbles and granites, and we know that a lot of this stuff was reused. Even on part of the altar, we have an inscription that was broken in order to fit the pedestal.
So this is recycled. They just took this from someplace else and slapped it on there?
Exactly.
While the crowds cheered for blood sport in the circus, the Mithraians were busy scavenging marble and piecing together their temple. But despite the limitations, this secret group built a sanctuary that has lasted for 17 centuries. So how does the 5-story storage facility above not collapse with a nearly 2,000-year-old temple as its foundation? That's a lot of weight. I couldn't even imagine the tonnage that is on this 2nd century structure.
Yeah, but also look at the width of the ancient wall. It's an incredibly wide structure. These are compressive materials, and so although we have a 4 or 5-story building resting on the ancient one, there's no risk of collapse.
So you've got a modern building resting on top of a 2nd century temple. I mean, there's your layers of history right here. That's amazing. The Mithraeum was just one of countless secrets that existed in the shadows of ancient Rome.
Rome has been an active archaeological dig for about 200 years, and yet we're still turning up new finds. Eventually, we'll be able to uncover more of that 90% of the ancient city that's still trapped under the modern layers. But this is a process that will go on for probably centuries.
With only 10% of the city's underworld excavated over the past 200 years, many more clues to the rise of the empire remain hidden beneath the streets. Up next, this is fantastic. Signs of life from Nero's sinister reign. So I'm standing in the toilet right now. You propped yourself, maybe something like this. There's probably a hole, and it came right down there. And there you go. And later, an emperor's massive stadium still stands, underground. This is huge. I mean, we just came off the street. You've got a whole new world down here.
Ancient Romans didn't live very long. The average male was lucky to reach the age of 30.
Beneath the soil of Italy's capital, there's a Rome you won't read about in history books. And in one particular spot, it's a world full of the vices of its villainous emperors and evidence of the lives of its slaves and ordinary citizens. 2,000 years ago, while the emperor was living in a sprawling palace, most Romans within the city lived in apartment blocks, or insulae. There were as many as 50,000 apartment buildings around the ancient city. Today, they are actually buried beneath the modern streets, entire subterranean neighborhoods that very few know exist. Local guide Olivia Ercoli agreed to take me to one of the few that's been discovered. Olivia?
Hello.
Hi, Olivia. Thank you for meeting with me.
My pleasure.
So why are we meeting in a bookstore?
Because this is a really special bookstore. This is a place which has Roman ruins underneath.
The bookstore sits on top of the remains of a 2,000-year-old apartment block. The complex was called the Vicus Caprarius. But there's more. Sharing the street level with the bookstore is an entire neighborhood of medieval apartment buildings. So a 2,000-year-old apartment block sits below an entire block of medieval homes.
So these buildings here, what era do they date back to?
These might date from anything from 13th, 14th century onwards.
13th or 14th century.
Olivia led me to the small subterranean space that's been occupied for 2 millennia.
This is fantastic. I mean, but honestly, this does not look ancient. It looks modern. I mean, does it look like 2-foot thick walls and brickwork?
This apartment complex was originally built during the vicious reign of Emperor Nero, sometime after 64 AD. It was inhabited by common Roman citizens for close to 400 years. Walking around, I could see that much of the structure is still intact. Today, we gut old buildings and rebuild, but the people who lived here through the centuries made their renovations on top of the old work.
You go back to the time of this fire of Nero, 64 AD. Then you have minor restructuring during 2nd century, major restructuring in 4th. And then you've got these layers here, which date back to 11th, 12th century.
They're really well preserved, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
The remains of the Vicus stood at least 3 stories high, and during its peak, it was located in a prime area. This building was typical of apartments during the Empire. On the ground floor, there would have been shops with various merchants. The first floor would have had balconies where the wealthier Romans would have lived. And finally, the top floor would have been for the less fortunate people, with no insulation and wooden walls. But one thing the Vicus building had over the other apartments was its own water source.
These people were lucky in that the Aqua Virgo, which was an aqueduct, passed very close to their home. And not only that, but there was a huge water reservoir.
So this apartment building, built in the 1st century, had its own water system here?
Yes.
2 massive water basins that could hold 4,000 gallons of water were built adjacent to the apartment complex. Water coming in from the aqueduct poured into the basin, and to accommodate the pressure 4,000 gallons of water put against the walls, the builders had to make them 6 feet thick. If the tanks filled up, the water would be released through the overflow channels. This was Roman civic waterworks at its best.
Here you can see where the 2 buildings are actually meet up. This water supply, the reservoir, Castellum Aquae, and the apartment block, which starts here.
And they were both built in the same era. It's the same type of masonry,
Yes,
isn't it?
Same time, after the fire of Nero, 64 AD.
The walls were so strong that they not only survived 400 years of habitation, they also later became the foundation of the medieval apartment building above.
Here you can see into a corridor, what was a corridor within the apartment block. You can see stairs which lead up from what used to be an open alleyway on one side of the building.
So can we get down there to see that?
That's right, yes. All you need is a pair of galoshes.
Do you have any galoshes for me?
Could be.
So I was about to enter an ancient Roman apartment complex. Much of the corridor was off limits. The stairs had eroded and the bottom level was flooded. And there was only room for 1 person at a time.
Okay, I'm working my way down the 1st century. These were additions in the 4th century. And look at this, man. This is some really cool herringbone pattern. You can see it looks like the bone of a fish, hence herringbone. And these are little small clay bricks, just patterned like that.
Looking around, it's not hard to imagine what the living quarters of this Roman middle-class apartment was once like.
So from the other side, we could see the steps. That's an arched cavity. You can still see the Roman arch right there, and that was used for steps. There's a staircase going down the other side. So this was a 4th century addition. You can see how elaborate it is. It's got a pattern in it. It's sort of the 4th century. People came in here, and they adapted the apartment for their needs. Might have been somebody who was more distinguished, had some more bucks, and wanted to redo it.
The apartments even had some of our more modern conveniences.
So I'm standing in the toilet right now. This probably was a ledge, like a little box here that came out. And oh yeah, you propped yourself maybe something like this. There's probably a hole, and it came right down there. And there you go. So you'd go use the latrine right there, and you might have a wash up here. And you can see there's a terracotta, a clay drainage pipe that feeds right out down through there and must go into that same system that the toilet runs into. This is really cool stuff here.
I was standing in the middle of ancient Rome, in an apartment not so different from the ones we have today. Its water tanks, plumbing, and building design revealed an advanced level of engineering that for an average citizen was unrivaled in the ancient world. But this first-century apartment block was more like a slum compared to the palace of Rome's infamous leader, Emperor Nero. In fact, many believe that the fire that destroyed two-thirds of the city and sparked the building boom of thousands of insulae was actually started by Nero to make room for his own decadent Domus Aurea. The fire of 64 AD started in the southeast corner of Circus Maximus and spread quickly throughout the working-class neighborhoods and industries around the Palatine Hill. It burned for 6 days and turned almost 70% of the city into a charred wasteland. After the fire, Nero confiscated a huge amount of burned neighborhoods around the Palatine Hill to build his private golden palace. The grounds of this palace, the Domus Aurea, covered 1/3 of the city. But that didn't leave much room for the public. Many ordinary citizens were forced to live in communal apartments, like the vicus I had just seen. Ironically, the emperor's opulent palace and the housing for the poor met the same fate. The Domus Aurea, which is buried beneath the Esquiline Hill, and the Vicus apartment building are practically all that remain of his reign of terror. More than 30 feet below the modern city, and only a few blocks from the site of Nero's palace, the Vicus Capraria stands as one of the few monuments to the average Roman.
The kind of people who lived here, they were what made Rome great. They're part of Rome's history, which didn't get much of a voice, because most of the history of the empire was written by senators, so people who never had a chance of living in this kind of insula.
It was a simple building, even for ancient Rome. But how many of our homes do you think will be standing 2,000 years from now? Up next, Rome stadiums weren't just for chariot races.
Many of them, in order to make ends meet, resorted to prostitution, a little bit of half-time entertainment.
Who knows what went underneath these arches, huh?
And later, Trajan's lost basilica is found.
This is what you'd love to find in your basement.
Oh my God. This is such a hidden jewel, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Emperor Hadrian preferred to bathe with commoners in public baths rather than with members of his own upper class.
When you visit Rome, you have to see Piazza Navona. It's a quarter-mile stretch of restaurants, wine bars, shops, and thousands of people checking out the scene. But this is nothing compared to what used to be here. Step back almost 2,000 years ago and dig down 20 feet, and you'll find the pride and joy of one of Rome's most notorious emperors.
To keep the people of Rome happy, its emperors knew they always had to provide bread and circus. Paying for elaborate games and competitions was one way of keeping a grip on the power in this ruthless town. So Domitian, the 11th emperor, built a new sports arena in his name, completed in 86 AD. Over the years, the stadium served many rulers, but eventually fell to ruin. Without the luxury of bulldozers in the 15th century, the piazza was simply built on top of the stadium. Today, the bowels of this stadium sit beneath almost every apartment on this block. It's off limits to the public, but guide Richard Bowen agreed to take me down.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for meeting with me.
Nice to meet you.
So, where's the stadium at?
Well, the stadium is here, basically. We're at Piazza Navona, and underneath where we're standing at this moment in time would have been the old stadium built by Domitian at the end of the 1st century AD.
There's a stadium underneath our feet.
There's a stadium underneath our feet.
An avid sports fan himself, Domitian was a regular at the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus. But he decided the city needed a smaller athletic arena for Greek-style track and field events.
Here we have the form of the piazza more or less sits upon the site of the sands.
So these would have been stands?
Yes, enough to hold something like 30,000 spectators.
Looking at Neptune fountain in the piazza, it was hard to imagine a Roman stadium with hordes of cheering spectators. But at the corner of the piazza, I got my first glimpse of what was really underground.
Richard, is this it?
This is Domitian Stadium here. Archaeologists believe this would have been one of the main entrances into the actual stadium.
And now, what is this? Are these apartment buildings?
These are apartment buildings that were built after the 1930s. Much of this area here was initially knocked down between 1936 and 1938 to create a broad boulevard. And fortunately, they've decided, if you like, to keep the shape of the piazza as it has been for 2,000 years as such there.
This is the thing about Rome. You turn a corner and then you're back 20 centuries.
That's right. Well, as I say, we have a shadow city here lurking underneath every footstep that we make here in Rome.
Part of the stadium is visible from the street, but as we step down onto the site, the busy piazza above us faded away.
Here we're going down to the end of the 1st century AD.
And we step back in time to the world of a 1st century sports fan.
This is huge. I mean, we just came off the street. You've got a whole new world down here.
Here you can see, obviously, a design that would have been in some shape or form or another similar to what we see today, for example, at the Colosseum. Not as tall, probably a third less high in comparison to the Colosseum, but you're seeing a stadium.
The Stadium of Domitian was almost 1,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, and 2 stories high. It had a capacity of 30,000 people. At the time, the city had 1 million citizens, and for them, going to the games was a regular part of Roman life. And it feels as though they just walked away from here. When Domitian built this massive stadium to prove his power, he probably didn't anticipate that almost 2,000 years later, it would be buried under one of Rome's busiest squares.
There's the street level, there's the current street level, about 20 feet up.
Yep.
And we would walk into the stadium, the Mission Stadium, right here through these grand arches.
Perhaps not exactly this one here, because we perhaps may not have been important enough, but certainly one of the arches over here to take our seats into the actual stadium itself.
Rome's senators and wealthy merchants entered through the grand arches in the center of the stadium, but the lower class had to use the side entrances. Spectators sat by rank and class, so naturally, the emperor had the best seats in the house.
Domitian probably is around about the halfway line, I would imagine. He would obviously have had his own box.
Got those nice seats at the 50-yard line.
That's right.
So about 1,900 years ago, it was similar to what we have today. You got your cheap seats, you got the reserve section, you got your royal box.
Well, definitely, yes. I mean, obviously some things never change.
And just like in a modern stadium, there were lots of people hawking food, drinks, and knickknacks. But in the shadows under these arches, there was also a much seedier business being conducted.
You had, obviously, a very small percentage of very, very rich people and a very large percentage of very, very poor people. Many of them, in order to make ends meet, resorted to prostitution. And the one place where this would happen is obviously here at Stadia, where you would have a large congregation of people. So the arch was a good place, as one might say, to procure business, it would appear, in the ancient period for a little bit of half-time entertainment.
Who knows what went underneath these arches, huh? Right on.
These very arches I was walking through were once a popular place to pick up hookers. Since prostitution was legal in ancient Rome, the hookers could work out in the open. In fact, because of the popularity of this practice, one of the Latin words for arch, fornic, is the root of the English word fornication. But the arches weren't just places to pick up prostitutes. They were key to Roman engineering. Previously, Greek public spaces were built into hills for support and relied on the surrounding topography. But the arch allowed the Romans to construct massive freestanding structures because it's such an optimal weight-bearing device. You can build floor upon floor using the arches to evenly distribute the tremendous weight of the structure. Arches were vital to Roman engineering, especially in structures of this size. The Romans built to last. They also developed mass-produced bricks and concrete. These materials, and the efficient way they used them, allowed the Romans to build at an impressive speed. Romans had construction down to a science.
It means you can start putting up your buildings in double quick time. And as a consequence of putting up in double quick time, it means that the emperor who actually sponsors the project in question perhaps will see it built in his lifetime, and also then have his name attached to it as well, which, obviously, as you can imagine, with the vanity involved with some of the emperors was important.
It only took 6 years to build Domitian Stadium, a lightning pace even by today's standards.
The Romans were able to put up stadia in a comparable way to modern stadia today. Now, whether or not they would have passed 21st century safety regulations, okay, that's another matter there.
So how did Domitian's great engineering marvel end up beneath the pavement of Piazza Navona? Rome endured centuries of neglect and destruction, and ancient structures like this stadium were eventually looted and destroyed. Like the rest of ancient Rome, it was slowly buried by the ongoing construction, dirt, and debris of the city. Then in the 16th century, a fruit and vegetable market sprouted up on the top of the ruins of the stadium. Today, it's Piazza Navona, surrounded by shops and homes, all using the ruined stadium for their foundation. So as modern Romans walk down the streets, live in their homes, and shop in the markets, many of them have no idea that a stadium that was once Domitian's pride and joy now supports their city above. Up next, Emperor Trajan, exposed where you'd least expect it.
Oh my God, I mean, you've got a pillar right here, just laying on the floor of the basement of the Fendi building.
And later,
Now let us walk down to the site.
one of the first fire stations in the world.
This is incredible. This is the Underworld, isn't it?
Yeah.
Emperor Caligula was known to feed the Colosseum's wild animals with prisoners when cattle was too expensive.
Under Emperor Trajan, the territory of the Roman Empire was at its height, stretching over 2.3 million square miles. His military success brought the empire tremendous wealth, and to share that with the city, he built a brand new forum that would dwarf the old ones. Its centerpiece was a massive basilica built of marble, bronze, and gold. Now, much of Trajan's forum has been excavated, but where is his famous basilica? In the pantheon of Roman emperors, Trajan was one of the good guys. In fact, the Roman Senate added Optimus, meaning the best, after his name to show their highest approval. Like many of the emperors before him, he added his own structures to the city of Rome. Not lavish palaces for the rich, but places for the blue-collar workers who built this empire. Places like civic offices, baths, and stadiums that improved life for ordinary Roman citizens. Today, the Forum and the Column of Trajan are among the most famous Roman sites. But there's virtually no trace of the towering bronze-covered basilica that once stood beside them. Unless, of course, you know where to look. As tourists walk past this ordinary building, few know that they're walking over the ruins of an engineering marvel that's just been discovered deep under the city. A team of archaeologists is excavating the site, and I get private access to it from a member of that team, Darius Arya.
Dar?
Yes, hi, how you doing?
Hey, Dar, thanks for meeting with
Hey,
me.
nice meeting you.
So where's this basilica at?
All right, the basilica is underneath us right now, continuing in a line all the way to those 2 rows of columns. The space was huge, it was 600 feet long. And then extended even further towards the Victor Emmanuel Monument.
It's hard to believe that underneath this street once stood an ancient basilica almost 3 city blocks long. The basilica was a majestic courthouse filled with imperial offices and law courts. It was the administrative nerve center for an empire that extended from England to the Persian Gulf and included 60 million people. Several years ago, the Fendi family, one of Italy's most famous fashion dynasties, bought a Renaissance palace just steps from Trajan's Column in central Rome. The palace has been turned into a modern exhibition space, but 113 AD is just steps away.
So we're walking through the Al Fendi site for exhibitions. And as we all know, that underneath Rome, there's always something ancient. You just have to start digging. Well, they started digging, and they found something truly spectacular.
Workers digging in the basement unearthed the remains of the long-sought-after Basilica Oppia.
This is what you'd love to find in your basement.
Oh my God, I mean, you've got a pillar right here, just laying on the floor of the basement of the Fendi building.
Exactly.
This is such a hidden jewel, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, you look out there, that's the Forum right there.
Yeah,
and this continues on into somebody's basement, and nobody knows that this is here.
This enormous building was part of a massive complex completed in 113 AD that included the Forum, Trajan's Column, and an immense bronze statue of Trajan, which vanished during the Middle Ages. It was a staggering testament to Trajan's power, as well as his wisdom as a ruler.
He builds this for the people. You've got a big courthouse, which represents the greatness of Rome, its laws, through which it governed people.
People came here to conduct legal business, shop from the many vendors outside the basilica, or just to hang out.
And you have people coming and gathering, the public, interested in hearing about the new case, who's being sued, who's being divorced, for how much money, and so on. It's totally open to the public.
Trajan poured money and precious materials from numerous countries into the basilica so that the commoners could share in the greatness and magnificence of Rome.
This is a massive chunk of marble.
This is gigantic. This is brought in all the way from Egypt. So you got to think about what this meant to a Roman, you say. This is coming from a great distance. This is coming at a great expense. It's at the expense of the emperor, it's at the expense of the state, It's glorifying Rome, it's glorifying me as a Roman citizen. A citizen can come in here and feel proud.
But how was such a revered structure just forgotten beneath the streets? The basilica was still in use for many more centuries, but seems to have been abandoned in the late Middle Ages. By the time of the Renaissance, the ruin was filled with trash and dirt and made a perfect foundation for the palace and piazza that were built above it, the same Fendi-owned palace turned exhibition space that rests above us right now. But the basilica was never meant to carry this much weight, so the fact that it's still standing is a credit to the marvels of Roman engineering.
They're extremely meticulous in the erection of columns, because it's such a tedious process you don't want to have to do more than once. You can actually see the fittings or the metal pins holding it in place.
It looks like it's smaller. You can actually see where it's grooved.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's going to be soldered in place. They have metal pins of iron, and then they pour in molten lead. Because lead is going to then render the iron pin waterproof. Otherwise, it's going to eventually rust and expand and break, and that's not going to be very good for the stability of the column.
When this site was discovered in 2004, modern-day engineers faced a tough question. How can they save the ruins of the basilica while turning the Renaissance palace into a modern exhibition space? To protect the site, modern Romans took a page from their ancestors and placed these modern columns exactly where the ancient columns once stood. They even used the bases from the original columns as foundations for the new ones. But instead of holding up Trajan's basilica, these new columns hold up today's city.
So that's quite a tribute to Roman engineering that they're actually using a column. Mind you, a modern column, but based on the ancient idea. And that's holding up this modern piazza, modern
Absolutely.
building.
I mean, they have to be practical because they've got to have some way in modern means to sustain this massive ceiling. So it's very, very clear to everyone walking through here that this is something that's just been made a couple of years ago. At the same time, it preserves the idea of what was here, which is a row of columns in the basilica.
Thousands of people labored for 6 years to build the basilica, and almost 2,000 years later, a team of engineers, architects, and archaeologists like Darius are working to bring it back to life.
It's a coordinated effort, and at times it might seem like it drags on. I mean, excavations can take years and years and years, but the material that you're pulling out is fleshing out a picture. But it's a way of really getting the full picture of how great Rome was, how it declined, how it fell, how things got forgotten, then ultimately how things got recuperated and reappreciated.
It may be the underworld that tells you these things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Up next, Rome's first emperor fights fire and takes on the city's criminals.
It's one of ancient Rome's most famous urban legends. Was Emperor Nero pregnant? To find out the real answer, go to history.com/cities for our new web series, The Naked Underground.
Today, big cities have a lot of problems. Pollution, crime, fire. Well, ancient Rome was no different. So when Emperor Augustus saw what was happening to his city, he acted quickly. He cleaned up the river, he built roads and aqueducts, and he started one of the world's first fire brigades. Today, you can still see evidence of how Augustus changed the city. But sometimes, you have to dig deep to find it.
When Augustus became Rome's first emperor in 27 BC, the Republic was in a state of lawlessness, and the capital was in shambles. Augustus rolled into action and used the city's slaves and freed men to help him rebuild the city.
Elizabeth?
Hello, yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Welcome.
Classical archaeologist Elizabeth Furman was going to take me 25 feet below this quiet residential street near the Tiber to give me a glimpse of that lost world.
We have to go down to the 2nd century AD.
Great.
Buried beneath this modern apartment building and down this shadowy staircase was one of the world's first fire stations.
So come down, another 4 steps, and we are on the original level.
This is incredible. This is the underworld, isn't it?
Yeah,
Actually, this is the first example of an ancient fire station found in Rome.
and that was an open courtyard. So you could enter here, you were in the open air. We have here a fountain, because water was, of course, the symbol of our
Are you kidding?
firemen.
This is a fountain.
Yeah.
The fire station, or exubitorium, was unearthed in the 1860s when some treasure hunters were searching for lost Roman art. They ended up discovering a priceless time capsule from nearly 1,800 years ago. Today, this is just a forgotten Roman ruin under an ordinary apartment building. But 1,700 years ago, it would have been filled with up to 400 men, all former slaves who had won their freedom and become Roman citizens. These men played a very important role in saving the city from one of its biggest threats: fire. Rome was a bustling capital with over 1 million residents, most of whom used open fires for cooking, heating, and lighting, turning their homes into virtual tinder boxes.
Fire broke out nearly every night.
After a terrible fire destroyed a large part of the city in 23 BC, Rome's first emperor, Augustus, decided it was time for a total overhaul of the way the city protected its people. Based on a military command structure, the vigiles, or watchmen of the city, were among the first organized fire departments. And I was standing in one of the earliest fire stations ever built. How good were these firemen? Could they put out a fire?
They had different tools, like, of course, buckets, where they could pump the water. And it seems also that they used big pieces of cloth or thick blankets that were first put in water, of course, and then used to extinguish the fire.
Fighting fires wasn't the only responsibility of the men who once worked here. They also served as cops, patrolling Rome's sinister streets, teeming with thieves, thugs, and assassins. To protect them from the daily dangers of their work, the men prayed to the god Tinius at a small sanctuary inside the firehouse. So this ornate, look at the roof and the things.
It's like a little temple, no?
This
like
is a temple.
A little temple architecture here produced on a very small scale. This was somehow the representative area of the site, where one entered and could immediately understand who was here the protecting god, what was the function, who was working here, and so on.
It really would have been incredible down here. But by the mid-3rd century, the firehouse was no longer in use. Then in the medieval era, the Roman walls were put to a new use as sturdy foundations. We have brick here and we have fieldstone and mortar. What's this for?
When the site was excavated, of course, all the material had been taken away, and there was the danger that some of these walls would collapse. And so this is a reinforcement. In reality, our modern house is still sitting on the ancient Roman structures.
From the original Roman firehouse to the modern-day apartments, each generation has built upon this same site. Not only did they use the ancient walls for their foundation, but also made sure to reinforce them, saving the lost empire hidden beneath the streets. So before Nero's reign of terror, or Trajan's massive basilica built for his people, the very first emperor, Augustus, was coming up with ways to secure his power. By shielding his buildings from fire and protecting the citizens from criminals, he was taking control. And this 1,700-year-old firehouse buried under the streets was evidence of his legacy. The firehouse sheds rare light on the daily life of ordinary Romans and the way the imperial city was run. But today, few know it exists.
And that's just a little piece of the puzzle. So with the help of some of these sites, we are able to reconstruct the rest of our underground world.
There's a whole other world buried beneath Rome's streets. And with each discovery, more secrets are revealed. From city services like the fire department to massive opulent palaces, each emperor played his part in creating the world's greatest empire. And the evidence is hidden underground. Throughout history, no city has had more influence on the world than ancient Rome. It was a city built by the greatness and greed of its emperors and the hard work of its soldiers, citizens, and slaves. Preserving that incredible history will be a huge challenge for